Okay, so here we go with part D, connective tissues. This video will be about the same length, maybe a little bit shorter than the last one. And then the next video is the last video that will be a little bit shorter. So we are focusing on solely connective tissue. So we've covered and finished talking about epithelial tissue. Remember, you should be able to identify the type of tissue, whether I show you a figure of it or to identify it based off of its characteristics. Or you need to know where in the body you can find those epithelial tissues, each type, and then the general functions of each of those types of tissues. Same thing goes for connective tissue, but we've got some different stuff to talk about. Like this figure, or this slide, shows you a breakdown of all the different types of connective tissue that we're going to talk about in this particular lecture video. So the categories here are connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissue, and supportive connective tissue. So what you might need to know about this is which of these tissues is considered connective tissue proper. So there is no tissue that we can point at and touch or identify and say that's connective tissue proper, but all of these tissues, areolar connective tissue, adipose, reticular, dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic, are part of or basically are considered connective tissue proper, one specific type of connective tissue proper. And that's broken down into loose connective tissue and dense. So again, you can't point to a slide or point to a figure and say that's loose connective tissue, but areolar connective tissue, adipose tissue, which is fat tissue, and reticular tissue, sorry about that, guys, that's my puppy, are specific examples of loose connective tissue. Dense connective tissue is considered dense regular connective tissue. CT is connective tissue. Dense irregular and elastic connective tissue. And then the fluid connective tissues are blood and lymph. Supportive connective tissues are cartilage. There's 3 different types of cartilage. So just like loose connective tissue is a category, here's the specific types of loose connective tissue. Cartilage is a category of supportive connective tissue. Here's the specific types. And there's bone. So we're going to go through all of these and identify them, talk about where they're located, and then talk about the functions of each of these tissues. Same thing with epithelial tissue. You need to know how to identify them, where they're located, specific properties of them, and then their functions. In all connective tissue, there's some components that make up this connective tissue. Like extracellular protein fibers. So there's a bunch of cells that we'll talk about, like the major cell types of each type of tissue, like the major cell type of cartilage is called a chondrocyte. Remember, cyte means cell. So in chondro, that root word means cartilage. So a chondrocyte is a major cell type of cartilage. And you can also find fibers, like there's reticular fibers that branch, and we'll talk about the type of, it's called reticular connective tissue that is made up of reticular fibers. Collagen fibers. Collagen fibers are thick, but don't branch. They're strong and straight. They may be a little bit wavy, but they're really strong and they resist stretching. And elastic fibers are thin. They do not branch, and they're very stretchy. So they can go from really wavy to really stretched out. Think about a rubber band, from where it goes from wavy and kind of misshapen, and when you pull on it, it stretches out. Elastic fibers act like a rubber band. There's another type of substance called ground substance, and this is the fluid component of connective tissue that fills the spaces between cells. It's typically clear and colorless. And then there's 2 types of cells that you can find in connective tissue. Some are fixed or stuck there, and some are wandering. They can move into or out of that connective tissue. Here we go. Let me see if I went too far. Nope. Okay. Areolar tissue is loose tissue or loose connective tissue. The fixed cells in that tissue, this areolar tissue, is the most common form of loose connective tissue. So I'm going to flip back and remind you that here's loose connective tissue under connective tissue proper. There's 3 types: areolar connective tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular tissue. Those are all types of loose connective tissue. The most common type is areolar connective tissue. In that tissue, you'll find fixed cells, cells that are stuck there, that stay there. One type of cell is called a melanocyte. It synthesizes melanin, which is responsible for basically the pigment of your skin. We'll talk about melanocytes more when we get to the integumentary system next. Fixed macrophages. Macrophages basically undergo phagocytosis, so they can engulf pathogens that are not supposed to be there, that could cause problems or disease. Those are there to help just protect that tissue and protect you and keep you safe. Mast cells, they secrete this substance that causes local inflammation, but that helps you defend against those pathogens that may be located there, or if you get a cut, or if you get an infection somewhere. This local inflammation, because of substances secreted from mast cells, can isolate that damage or that infection. Fibroblasts are really, really, really important in connective tissue. Fibroblasts synthesize the extracellular fibers, like those reticular fibers, the other fibers that we talked about, collagen fibers. So this is the slide before this, collagen fibers and elastic fibers. So these fibers of the extracellular, in the extracellular fluid, in the ground substance, are produced by fibroblasts. And then adipocytes, adipose tissue is fat, and cyte is cell. So those adipocytes or adipocytes store lipids. So these are the fixed cells that you can find in loose connective tissue or areolar connective tissue. Wandering cells can move in and out. Plasma cells produce antibodies, and antibodies are what attack infection. Free macrophages, as opposed to fixed macrophages that can also undergo phagocytosis or engulf pathogens or debris, are the same thing as fixed macrophages. They're just able to wander into and out of this tissue. Stem cells repair damage. Some of the phagocytic white blood cells, so there's other white blood cells we'll talk about in the lymphatic system that can phagocytose just like a macrophage can. There's actually 3 of 5 types of white blood cells that are phagocytic. And then lymphocytes is another type of white blood cell that can move into and out of tissues that can defend against specific pathogens like viruses and bacteria. So here's an example of areolar connective tissue. Right here would be reticular fibers. Remember, they branch. There's collagen fibers, long, thicker, really strong fibers. Here's an elastic fiber. Where is it pointed out on the side? There it is, elastic fibers. Those elastic fibers are really thin and stretchy. There's a free macrophage. There's a lymphocyte. Lymphocytes are smaller cells, but with a really big nucleus, takes up most of the cell. There's an adipocyte. All of this in here is stored fat, stored lipid, and the nucleus usually gets shoved to the side of the cell. There's a mast cell that secretes that molecule or that substance that helps produce, basically cause inflammation. There's a plasma cell and a melanocyte. There's the branching melanocytes. Fibroblasts are these cells here that kind of look like a starburst. I'll show you them again later. But these fibroblasts have a nucleus. The cell is pretty big and it branches. These cells are the cells that produce these fibers. So this is areolar connective tissue. Adipose tissue is fat tissue. So adipo is fat. So the major cell type of adipose tissue is an adipocyte. You can find some adipocytes outside of adipose tissue, like in areolar connective tissue, but they're clustered and really densely packed together in adipose tissue. It's one of the most common forms of loose connective tissue, along with areolar connective tissue. It's found in the hypodermis, under the skin. It forms layers of padding around the eye. You can find it in the abdominal pelvic cavity. You're probably very familiar with where you can find adipose tissue. Around the kidneys, it helps cushion visceral organs or internal organs and keep them safe. There's a big percentage of adipocytes in areolar connective tissue, so it helps basically form a cushion layer under the skin. Because not only is there a layer of adipose tissue under the skin near the hypodermis, but there's also adipocytes in connective tissue that further help cushion. So look at these cells. Here's an adipocyte. So all of this, adipocytes don't take up stain very well on a microscope slide because the triglycerides, the storage form of fat, is located inside here and it packs inside these cells. So the nuclei kind of get shoved to the side of the cell so that triglyceride can take up most of the cell. So these big rounded kind of balloon-shaped cells with a tiny nucleus that gets pushed to towards the cell membrane on one side of the cell. And right here is the hypodermis. There's adipose tissue. It's usually yellow in color in figures and in the body in general. Dense connective tissue. So we just finished loose connective tissue. We talked about adipose tissue and areolar connective tissue specifically. Dense connective tissues are made up of dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and elastic tissue. So dense regular connective tissue is found in tendons and ligaments. Where can you find tendons and ligaments, or what do they attach? Right, muscle to bone, tendons, and bone to bone, ligaments. And they're arranged in parallel to one another. So there's long, thin fibers. Collagen fibers are long and thin, and it's regularly packed together. Dense irregular connective tissue, the fibers are arranged in a mesh network, so they resist tension in a lot of different directions, whereas dense regular connective tissue will only resist tension in one direction, the direction in which the collagen fibers are running. These collagen fibers run in every which direction, so dense irregular connective tissue can resist force in every which direction. And you can find it layering, basically covering visceral organs, so internal organs. It's the superficial layer covering bones, cartilage, some peripheral nerves, and the dermis of the skin. So you can find dense irregular connective tissue everywhere. So this is dense regular connective tissue. This would be a tendon from the tricep muscle in the back of your arm, upper arm. So look at the fibers all run in the same direction. There's a nuclei, right? These fibers, these are nuclei of fibroblasts. Remember, fibroblasts produce these collagen fibers. So all these collagen fibers run in the same direction. They're really tightly packed together. This is dense irregular connective tissue. So if you take a cross-section of it, here's the skin. So this dark purple line designates the difference between the epidermis, the outermost layer, right? Here's a layer of stratified squamous epithelium, right? The dermis. And as you get deeper into the dermis, you run into dense irregular connective tissue. You can find areolar loose connective tissue in the outer layer of the dermis. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. And then dense irregular connective tissue can be found in the dermis of the skin, the deeper layer of the dermis. Look at these fibers. These are collagen fibers, but they're running in a bunch of different directions. So if you basically put force on this tissue, it can resist that force in any which direction, because the collagen fibers are laid out in such a different manner in this network. So before we move on to another type of connective tissue, I want to talk about membranes, because there's 4 different types of membranes in the body, and the membranes in your body are made of a layer of connective tissue and a layer of epithelial tissue. So there's not true epithelium because it lacks a basement membrane, and there's big gaps between cells. But this synovial membrane lines mobile joints. So think about your elbow, your shoulder, your knee. This membrane lines the bones that create those joints. So right around your elbow, where we talked about like the humerus, the bone in the upper arm, and the ulna and the radius, the bones in the lower arm, lining those bones where they fit together into the joint, you can find a synovial membrane. Basically, that lubricates the joint cavity with a fluid to protect the joint so that you don't have bone-on-bone contact, which can cause damage and a lot of pain. Mucous membranes line passageways that are open to the external environment, like the mouth, the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, your reproductive tract, your urinary tract. Those areas where there's epithelial surfaces are lubricated with mucus and other fluids. And the layer below that epithelium is a layer of areolar connective tissue called the lamina propria that supports the epithelium. So this mucous membrane is made up of the epithelial tissue located in those areas, and a layer of connective tissue, which is areolar connective tissue, specifically called the lamina propria, that supports that epithelium. So this membrane happens to be made of two types of tissues we've already talked about. So mucous membranes would be the epithelial tissue that would line those organs and the connective tissue below it. Serous membranes line body cavities in the ventral cavity that is not exposed to the external environment. So there's three types of serous membranes. One type is called the pleura. Around what organ do you think you can find the pleura? Remember that table back in chapter 1 that had root words? Pleura means lungs. So these serous membranes, there's two layers of serous membranes that surround the lungs, cover the lungs, called pleura. Peritoneum lines the abdominal cavity and covers the digestive system and urinary, some reproductive system organs. And the pericardium, where can you find that? Peri means around, right? So this is around the heart. Good. There's a single layer of simple squamous epithelium that's supported by areolar connective tissue. So both mucous membranes and serous membranes have a layer of epithelium. The epithelium is different between mucous and serous membranes. In serous membranes, it's simple squamous epithelium, supported by connective tissue below it, areolar connective tissue. That's called the lamina propria. Basically, this serous membrane secrete what's called serous fluid that protect the organ that's underlying these membranes. The last type of membrane is a cutaneous membrane, where there's a layer of stratified squamous epithelium. The cutaneous membrane is your skin, right? So it's lined by stratified squamous epithelium and then areolar connective tissue underlying it. So in any membrane that we're talking about, there's a layer of areolar connective tissue bound to an epithelial tissue that creates the whole membrane itself. And underneath that areolar connective tissue in the cutaneous membrane is dense irregular connective tissue that we just talked about a few slides ago. It's a really thick membrane. It's relatively waterproof and usually pretty dry. Remember the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium that we talked about in the previous lecture video? Basically makes those cells waterproof. So here's the 4 different types of membranes. Synovial, right? Here's cartilage on one side and cartilage on another side of the joint, right? So there's bone and bone. There's the layers of that membrane. There's epithelial tissue and areolar connective tissue, the lamina propria, and a mucous membrane that secretes mucus to the outer layer where you can find it. Serous membranes, there's a layer of simple squamous epithelium and areolar connective tissue. And then the cutaneous membrane, the epithelium, the areolar connective tissue, and dense irregular connective tissue. So the membranes are different with regard to their layers and the type of tissue you can find in those layers. And their locations are different and their functions are slightly different. Cartilage is another type of connective tissue. And there's 3 types of cartilage. All cartilage has a firm rubbery matrix, it's kind of fluid component, that contains what's called chondroitin sulfate, which is a major portion of the tough part of cartilage. In that matrix, there's chondrocytes, and chondrocytes are trapped in a small chamber called a lacunae. So cartilage itself has a number of different structures, like chondroitin sulfate, that forms what's called a proteoglycan. Proteoglycans are these structures in cartilage that basically just determines the physical properties of that cartilage. So the type or the strength or the flexibility of the cartilage. And the cartilage itself is surrounded by what's called perichondrium. So peri means around, chondro means cartilage. So there's a layer of dense irregular connective tissue that makes up what's called the perichondrium. So around bone, there's what's called the periosteum. Peri means around, osteo means bone. The periosteum is a layer of dense irregular connective tissue that surrounds bone and protects it. The perichondrium is a layer of dense irregular connective tissue that surrounds and protects cartilage. And there's three types: hyaline cartilage, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage, where you can find synovial membranes, you can typically find hyaline cartilage, like the tips of ribs where they meet up with bone, the ends of long bones, like your humerus in your upper arm or your femur in your upper leg, and covering bone surfaces at joints. So think about the bones that create your elbow or your knee, your hip, your shoulder. Where those bones connect to one another at a joint, there's hyaline cartilage. And it provides a somewhat flexible environment, but supports and reduces friction, so that as you move your elbow, or you flex and extend your elbow, or you move your shoulder, or you flex and extend your knee, you don't damage the bone located there, because that cartilage just provides this kind of flexible movement in there and support. Elastic cartilage, like in your outer ear, so take your ear and move it around, what you can feel in your ear. That distorts, and you can move it, and it'll kind of flatten back to its original shape because of the elastic cartilage. Now, as opposed to in hyaline cartilage, where there's a lot of collagen fibers, there's more elastic fibers here in elastic cartilage. And then fibrocartilage is found in some of the knee joint, between the pubic bones, in your pelvis, and then between the vertebrae. So if you've ever heard of somebody saying, I slipped a disc in my back, that's an intervertebral, between the vertebrae, disc. That disc is a disc of fibrocartilage, and that resists compression and limits the movement that you can do with your spine. So here's hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, all of this is matrix or ground here. That's all the fluid substance, but there's collagen fibers in there. They just pack so tightly together that you can't really see them with the microscope. And all these cells here are chondrocytes. So these chondrocytes have a unique shape. For the most part, they cluster together, and they're encased in a lacunae, the chamber here. And they have to have a lacunae because they need space, and cartilage is really dense. So to have space, they get trapped in this chamber. Chondrocytes usually have a dome shape to them, and then they cluster in 2, 3, 4, or 5s. So you see the dome shape to one side, dome shape to another side. Here's a perfect example of two chondrocytes that have a dome shape on one side and a flat shape on the other, and they cluster together in a group of 2. So that's pretty characteristic of cartilage. If you see chondrocytes, you know you're looking at least one type of cartilage, and you can narrow it down from there to see what type it is. There's elastic cartilage. So in the outer ear here, those fibers here are all elastic fibers, and they do show up on a microscope, on a histological slide. So when you see chondrocytes, there's chondrocytes, and then elastic fibers, you're looking at elastic cartilage. And then fibrocartilage, found in the intervertebral discs, right? Or it is the intervertebral disc. Chondrocytes tend to line up in a row in fibrocartilage. So you'll see long rows of fibrocartilage, or chondrocytes in fibrocartilage. You can see some collagen fibers, but they're pretty tightly packed together, so they don't show up really well, but they're there, more so than what you can see in hyaline cartilage. And then the chondrocytes, again, line up in a row. Bone tissue is also considered connective tissue. Osseous or osteo means bone, and it's connective tissue with a really hard matrix. There's a tiny bit of ground substance, which is fluid component. 2/3 of the matrix is mostly made up of stored calcium as calcium salts, and the remaining third is all collagen fibers. So basically what happens is these calcium salts, calcium stored in bone is what makes bone hard. The collagen fibers are strong but a little bit flexible. So in combination with collagen fibers and calcium, the bone becomes a little bit flexible but really, really strong, and it resists shattering because of the calcium salts that are deposited. It's allowed to be a little bit flexible because of the collagen fibers. And there's 2 types of bone: compact bone and spongy bone. You'll see compact bone also labeled or identified as cortical bone, It's organized into concentric layers. And then spongy bone or cancellous bone has a network of little tiny bone arches of bone. And bone is and we'll talk about bone later in the semester, but it has a very different organization than cartilage. It remodels, it changes, and basically changes its shape throughout life. And it can grow thicker and stronger with physical activity, or it can get thin and brittle with inactivity. So think osteoporosis. Remember, osteo is bone, and bones become porous as we get older and as we are more and more inactive. So here is compact bone here. So this bone lines up into concentric circles. Each one of those concentric circles is called an osteon. Remember, osteo is bone. At the edge, so if this is the humerus, the bone in your upper arm, if you cross section it and then blow up a section of that, this is all bone tissue, osseous tissue. This is all compact bone, really tightly packed together. Cortical or cancellous bone or spongy bone lines the inner kind of cavity of this long bone. So when you look in the innermost portion of this bone, there's a cavity. Lining that cavity is spongy bone. Those arches, those little connecting arches of bone is characteristic of spongy bone. And there's a table to kind of summarize that. Compact bone is covered by periosteum. It's a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that attaches bone to the surrounding tissues and also tendons and ligaments. So the connection of a tendon from a muscle into a bone happens by way of the periosteum, this connective tissue, dense, irregular connective tissue. In bone, you find osteocytes, the major cell type of bone. Osteo is bone, cyte is cell, right? Bone cells. And they're located in chambers, just like chondrocytes were located in chambers called lacunae. Osteocytes are located in chambers called lacunae. So I'm going to flip back here. These little dots here, and here, and here, those are all lacunae where you can find an osteocyte. And between two lacunae, there's a little canal called a canaliculus. These are small canals that connect one osteocyte in one lacunae, one chamber, to an osteocyte in another chamber. So there's little tiny canals that run through bone. Bone is really densely packed and tight and hard. To move through bone, there has to be a space. The space that connects one lacunae to another between osteocytes is a canaliculi. And then a central canal is another space, a canal in bone at the center of the osteon, which is the major functional unit of compact bone. So right here, this circular structure, I went back a couple slides, is an osteon. Right there at the center of the osteon is the central canal. Down here, this is one osteon. Right here are lacunae with osteocytes, and these little tiny tall structures here, those are canaliculi, right? And the central canal at the center of an osteon. And that's it for connective tissue. So feel free to go back into any part of this video. I know I talk fast, but you have the ability to pause and restart and rewind and fast forward. So if you need to, again, don't hesitate to ask questions. Send me emails. We can start a Canvas discussion if you need help with anything. You need to know how to identify each of these types of tissue, where you can find these tissues and their major functions, and then some cell types and fiber types that you can find in these tissues. So you should be familiar with everything we talked about. Good luck studying, and I'll see you soon.